So our political party system overall is, according to scholars, a two-party system. It's one of the most important things about our system. But also, the party system in the United States is, the party organizations themselves are fairly non-hierarchical and decentralized compared to other party systems. The Claremont Democrats, for instance, do not take orders from the National Democratic Party, and the National Republican Party doesn't control what happens at the local level with the Republican parties. It's very decentralized. There isn't any kind of staffing or anything like that at the local levels. And this is quite a bit different than you'll find in other countries, political party systems in other countries. Now, the party officials, elected officials, have become more polarized also. This is another aspect of our current party system. Let me just show you how this looks. This is a chart that's in your textbook. This is the House of Representatives, 1952, 2012. These are votes cast from liberal to conservative and what the party was of the person who cast that vote. And you can see that there's stuff in the middle here, and there are also even some overlap. Over here, nothing in the middle and no overlap. It's a good illustration of how a polarization has happened. Elected officials, the ones who have been elected and sent to Congress, are casting votes that are both more liberal and more conservative, and they're not making decisions that overlap with people from the other party very much. Now, if we ask why this is, why are we getting more polarized elected officials, there are three kinds of answers that could be given. You could either think about the history or process or the electorate itself. In terms of history, one of the explanations that's been given is coalitional sorting. And this is the stuff that we were just talking about. The fact that there aren't any more Dixiecrats or progressive Republicans because of this coalitional sorting. And if you go back to this chart right here, like these Democrats right here, we might call them Dixiecrats. They were probably Southerners who got elected as Democrats, but they're extremely conservative and really act more like Republicans. But it wasn't clear to everybody. The parties were still organized that way in the South. So those people have gone off and maybe they've retired or whatever, and other people decide to run from the South. And if they hold the same set of views, they're going to run as a Republican, right? So that's kind of what we refer to as coalitional sorting. And same thing has happened in the North. There aren't really very many progressive Republicans left either. Now, another explanation is what we call geographic sorting, which is reflective of the fact that, Democrats have tended to move into cities and Republicans have tended to move into rural areas. And this has meant that in many districts, the balance is so lopsided that it doesn't matter who actually runs from a particular party is going to win. I'll show you some data from this. These are counties in the country where the margin of victory of one party was more than 20%. And you can see over time that has increased very dramatically. So all of these areas in the West and the Midwest, where Republicans won with more than 20% of a margin. And then you can see in the cities and along the coast, that's where Democrats won by very large margins. And so when that happens, it means that whatever their views are, whoever is Republican is going to end up winning. It might also mean that, we have communities that are so homogeneous in terms of their political views that they end up self-reinforcing each other's views. Now, another set of reasons has to do with process. One reason that's been given is redistricting, which is the process of drawing maps. I'm going to come back to this later because it appears later in your textbook in the chapter on Congress. But primary elections are another way in which polarization has been enhanced. And I'm going to talk about some of these terms first, and then I'll come back and talk about this issue of primary elections and why this would happen. Another reason that's been given is that the people simply themselves are polarized, and so that they've elected polarized officials. So we'll look at some data about this and talk about it in a minute. So let's turn to the electorate then, those voters, right, and see how party in the electorate looks. Now, when we talk about the voters, we usually distinguish between three different kinds of voters. Strong partisans, weak partisans, people who are, again, registered for a party, but they are not very active. Leaners, party leaners. These are people who do not register for a party. Maybe they check no party preference, but they always vote for one party or another. And so we call them leaners. Sometimes we call them closet partisans. For some reason, they just don't want the label, right? And then we have true independents. These are people who did not register for a party, and it's really, they also really always shift back and forth from one party to another. This is not somebody who almost always votes Republican and then casts one vote as a Democrat for a Democrat, or the other way around. This is someone who, often is voting for different parties, and it's a fairly small percent of the population. And then we have the group of people who are not registered to vote at all. And usually, a lot of times when people are talking about these different characterizations, they forget about this group. And it's actually the largest single group. We do have a lot of people who are not registered. And let me just show you how this data looks. This is a chart that represents the votes cast by the voting age population altogether, and the votes cast by registered voters. Okay, now I'm going to scroll down. You can see the United States here. Here's the U.S., right? We have a really large gap here. And you could ask the question, why is that gap so large? Well, first off, we're pretty far this way in terms of the blue. Now remember, the blue is the percent of votes cast as a percent of the entire population. Now, one of the reasons that, there are probably three reasons that you could say that that might be really low. One is that a lot of people decide not to vote. They decide not to register and not to vote because it's somewhat difficult. There's hoops you have to jump through, and there's really not very much payback. It's not very much benefit to voting. And so the cost-benefit analysis often works in favor of not voting. Now, you might think to yourself, living where we do and like we do, that it's easy to register to vote. How could someone say that it's hard? Well, let's just contrast it to France. In France, when you're born, you are put into the voting database. And when you turn 18, you receive a card in the mail that says, okay, you can vote now, and your polling place is XYZ. And you don't have to do anything. You show up and your name's on the roster and you vote. It's quite a bit different. And so any little additional cost to the cost-benefit analysis for voting does have an outsized effect on whether people are actually going to vote or not. Another reason that the blue dot might be pretty far to the left is because we have large groups of people who actually are in the population but are not allowed to vote, either felons or people who are not citizens. And we have a larger group of that than other countries do. So if you look at this number here, the percent of registered voters who vote, we're actually doing really well on that, right? The percent of registered voters who vote. And that's because if somebody goes through the trouble of registering, it's pretty likely that they're going to end up voting. So we're up close to more than 85% of people that vote who are registered. Now, in terms of the party registration, these are some numbers that you should just be familiar with enough that you can recognize the relationship between them. In the U.S., there are more people registered for no party than either of the other two parties, and there are more Democrats than Republicans. California is kind of an outlier in two ways. We have more Democrats than anything else, and we also have a lot fewer people who choose not to register to vote. So we're kind of bucking the trend of the country on those two things. And then you should also be familiar with San Diego. San Diego had been for a long time one of the coastal counties that's Republican. In California, inland counties that are rural counties are mostly Republican, and coastal counties are mostly Democratic. San Diego for a long time was one of the Republican counties, and then in 2008 shifted to the Democratic Party. 2012 pulled about even. 2016, now there are more Democrats than the other two. So San Diego's been somewhat volatile, and party activists have been paying attention to the city for that reason. To the county, I should say. Now, thinking about party in the electorate and how it shows up correlated with other descriptive characteristics is important in understanding how party works in our system. So, for instance, party and race. We know that there's a strong preference among whites toward the Republican Party, and African Americans toward the Democratic Party. And this is one of the essential divisions, most important and most effective division that we have. And it's grown in recent years. Gender is also an important dividing line, and sometimes we refer to this as the gender gap, but it's less important than race. So you can see, for instance, that women overall vote Democratic more than Republican, but white women just very slightly more. So race is more active in that. Same with men. White men voting much more Republican than men in general, the larger group. Another factor, or three other factors that have been noticed in the recent election, this is data from the election, religiosity, age, and education. Let me just quickly play this video about this.
American voters have grown more racially diverse, better educated, less religious, and older. These shifts have reshaped both the Republican and Democratic parties, but in different ways. Non-whites are increasing as a share of all registered voters, and this increase has been more dramatic among Democrats than Republicans. The non-white share of Democratic voters has increased 18 percentage points since 1992, while the non-white share of GOP voters is up just 6 points. Americans are better educated today than in the past, and levels of education are rising fastest within the Democratic Party. The share of Democratic voters with a college degree is up 16 points since 1992. Meanwhile, the share of Republican voters who are college graduates has risen 3 points. The fastest growing religious group in the U.S. does not identify with a religion at all. It is those who are religiously unaffiliated, calling themselves atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. While the share of Republican voters who are unaffiliated has increased 6 points since 1996, the share of Democratic voters who are unaffiliated is up 19 points. The U.S. has grown older in recent decades, but this is especially true of Republican voters, who are now significantly older than Democrats. Since 1992, the share of GOP voters ages 50 and older has risen 20 points, compared with a rise of 6 points for this age group among Democratic voters. On most measures, the demographic changes transforming the nation have had a more pronounced impact among Democrats than Republicans. The result is two political parties whose voters look less alike today than they did 25 years ago.
So these are important trends in the way that party affiliation works in our society. Another issue that's gotten a lot of attention